push record. So you'll all be seeing the record button, and then I will go back to my introduction. So again, I'm Jennifer Statham from the Indian Education for All unit at the Montana Office of Public Instruction. Welcome to our first Indian Education for All Ethnobotany webinar with Rosalyn LaPier. I am excited to hear her presentation this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. Welcome everyone. We have so many from near and far joining us this evening. This is a webinar series created for Montana's pre-K through higher ed teachers. So please bear that in mind as you listen to the presentation. And also questions from the Q&A will be posed to the presenter in order of relevance to classroom instruction. So for those of you who are not from Montana, in 1972, Montana became the first state as it revised its constitution to enact a law called Indian Education for All, stating that all Montanans, regardless of age and background, be taught about the distinct and unique cultural heritage of each Montana tribe. In the Indian Education for All unit at the Montana Office of Public Instruction, we create resources and professional development opportunities such as this to support K-12 Indian Education for All implementation in meaningful, respectful, and tribally specific ways in all content areas. I would like to do a land acknowledgement, and in the spirit of healing, I acknowledge and honor that my feet are now resting on the ancestral homelands of the coastal Salish peoples of the Kitsap Peninsula in the state of Washington. I'm visiting my mother. The Suquamish tribe, speakers of Lushootseed, and the Port Gamble Sklallam tribe, speakers of Klallam. The Suquamish and Sklallam are both peoples continuing traditions that have shaped their cultures and lives, including fishing, hunting, singing, and dancing. I express my deepest respect and gratitude for their enduring care and protection of these beautiful shared lands and waterways. I would like to discuss a couple of norms. This is webinar format, and this is our first go. So again, my apologies for links going wrong and things like that, but we're working it out. We all learn as we go with the technology, right? So also please be patient as sometimes links change when settings and or seasons change. It is technology after all. As soon as the new links are available, or as soon as the sign-in sheet is available, which is only available during the webinar, they will open, and if there is an issue with access, I will fix it as soon as I am able. So the participant resources, as I mentioned, has a new link that Joan will put into the chat. You should all have access to that now. We are recording this for future use, so for your colleagues that you are really excited to share this with, there will be a link for the recording. Again, signing in is only necessary if you are seeking Montana Teaching Certificate Renewal Units, and please do put your name in the regular chat so we will know who is attending. The feedback survey link will be posted the last 10 minutes of the webinar. So please make sure you get that feedback survey. Even if you are not seeking renewal units, we want all of the feedback so we can continue improving each of these webinars. And the feedback survey is only open for 24 hours, so make sure you do that post haste. But now to introduce our wonderful presenter, and what a privilege and honor this is, Rosalyn. Dr. Rosalyn LaPier is an enrolled member of the Blackfeet tribe of Montana and Métis, and an award-winning Indigenous writer, ethnobotanist, and environmental activist. She holds a BA in physics and PhD in environmental history, and is currently an associate professor in the Environmental Studies Department at the University of Montana in Missoula. The focus of Dr. LaPier's work is to revitalize Indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge, address environmental justice and the climate crisis within Indigenous communities, and strengthen public policy for Indigenous languages. Welcome and Oki, Dr. LaPier.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to tonight's presentation. And I just want to mention that I think that the series on ethnobotany is going to be excellent. There's some excellent speakers coming up. And this is a great kickoff tonight to be able to share with you some information that I learned from my family. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. I need the host to actually allow me to share my screen first. But I'll begin by saying that I always acknowledge that I come from two traditions of knowledge. One is I do acknowledge that I come from Indigenous practices, and I learned traditional ecological knowledge from my grandmother and from my oldest aunt, and from the relatives that I learned from throughout my growing up. I also am educated in the Western educational system, and as was mentioned, I have an undergraduate degree in physics and a PhD in environmental history. So I always acknowledge that I have both of those systems of knowledge, both traditional knowledge and then also Western knowledge, and both of those actually form my teaching and my research and my working with students. So I always bring both of those to the table. So I'm going to begin. Let's see, excuse me 1 second. So tonight we're going to be talking about sort of what is ethnobotany and why is it important. And one of the things I think is important as educators that we think about is really how ethnobotany really permeates Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous traditions. And really there is sort of nothing within sort of Indigenous life that plants are not a part of. And so it's one of those things that once you start thinking about it, you kind of see it everywhere. And I'll just give an example. So for example, right now, if you can see me, I'm drinking a cup of tea, which is made out of a plant. I'm drinking licorice root right now. I'm sitting on a wooden chair. I'm at a wooden desk, and I'm also wearing clothing that's made out of cotton. So right now, my entire, my presentation is sort of permeated right now with plants and the plants that we use from day to day. So I want to begin by defining the difference between ethnobotany and botany. So ethnobotany is a term that's used primarily within the academy or within Western scholarship. It is a Western term that was created about 120 years ago. It was created at the turn of the last century by a botanist who was interested in understanding the relationship between people and plants. And so what is different about ethnobotany as a scientific study is that what it studies is the relationship between people and plants. Not all plants, but some plants. And those are the plants that are important to those people. Botany is the study of all plants. So when you hear about people who are botanists and people who are ethnobotanists, they do have, it is two different fields of study. And oftentimes botanists work with ethnobotanists and ethnobotanists work with botanists. So for example, here at the University of Montana, I have an internship that is called Native Plant Stewardship and Ethnobotany. And I collaborate with a botanist, and together, her and I lead this internship with students to teach them about native plants and to teach them about ethnobotany. And so she brings the botany to the table, which is understanding having that knowledge base about all different plants and understanding the evolution of plants. And I bring to the table that understanding the relationship between people and plants. On this particular slide, one of the things I wanted to point out is I have a picture on here of a woman's dress that is from the Ojibwe/Métis peoples, which is my father's side of the family. And one of the things that people from the Ojibwe do in terms of their regalia is they really use a lot of floral and plant life in their regalia. One of the things to think about when you look at Indigenous regalia, and if you see included in it things like floral designs or plant designs, don't just assume that the reason why people are including that is because it looks pretty or it's colorful. Oftentimes, what is being infused within this type of regalia is also Indigenous knowledge. One of the ways that people often taught different generations about Indigenous knowledge was through regalia. And so this is an example where you can look at a lot of different species of plants that are on this woman's dress. And it becomes not just a dress that you wear for events, but it also is a teaching tool that then can be used to share knowledge that gets passed down. So I wanted to also begin with a long list of the multiple ways that Indigenous people used plants in the past, but also use plants today. And this is adapted from a list that is from a book called Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson. And Kat Anderson in there included like all of the different ways that California tribes use plants. And so she had kind of an A to Z type list. And one of the things that most people think about when they think about ethnobotany is they usually think about medicine, right? They think about medicinal plants and how Indigenous people use plants for medicines and health and healing. But the other type, the other major use of plants is for food. So today I'm actually going to be talking about foods more than anything else, because I think that when you're in a teaching setting, although there are these multiple uses for plants that you can see here, and you can teach about some of these in a classroom setting, sometimes just the easiest way to teach about plants is through foods. So I'm going to provide a little bit examples later on of native plants that are foods here in the state of Montana. But as we are going forward, think about, and again, in future presentations where we're going to learn more about native foods from other presenters and from other tribes, they will also give you really good examples of how you can use this information in the classroom. But anyway, this gives you a good idea of kind of those multiple uses of plants. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, I always want to acknowledge that I come from two knowledge systems. And I learned about plants primarily from my grandmother and my oldest aunt. And I provide this graphic here of sort of 7 generations of knowledge. So when we think about Indigenous plant knowledge, we have to remember that it is a multi-generational and intergenerational knowledge that is sometimes gendered, where certain either women or men or two-spirit people have access and understand about plants that other genders don't know. So at least in Blackfeet society, women know more about plants than men do, and this information is shared intergenerationally. In this particular graphic, I include myself towards the lower end, but I also have 2 daughters who now have learned about plants and know about plants. As I mentioned, I learned from my oldest aunt. Her name was Teresa Still Smoking. I also learned from my grandmother, who is Annie Mad Plume Wall. She learned actually from her mother-in-law, because her mother had passed, and from her grandmothers. Her mother-in-law was Minnie Amesback. And my grandmother learned from her grandmothers, who were Mary Spotted Bear and a woman named Big Mountain Lion Woman. So you can see within really a short time of span, 7 generations of Blackfeet and now Métis women who know about plant knowledge And it has been passed down through the generations within our family of this information that I will talk about and share with you today. And then just to let you know, this is a photo of myself and my grandmother from about, I think, almost 20 years ago. But she lived to be 97, and she really was an amazing teacher. So you saw the list earlier of sort of all the different types of plant use. I want to focus now just for a bit on how the Blackfeet or the Botany used plants. And as I mentioned before, the two main uses of plants, of course, are for food and for medicine, but there's also a lot of other uses. So for example, plants get used as material for a lot of different purposes, from beauty products, such as how do you wash your hair, right? How do you clean your body? Clothing, dyes that are that you dye your clothing with, fuels, furniture, games. One of the things that people don't often think about is that plants were also used as pest repellents, right? How do you preserve your food and you keep pests away is you have another plant that you used for a pest repellent. They were also used for transportation and for, of course, utensils and weapons. So there's multiple uses that the Blackfeet had for plants, not just food and medicine, but for, again, their daily lives. They were sort of immersed in the plant world. Then there were a lot of other purposes for plants. One is what we call seasonal indicators. A seasonal indicator is a plant that when something happens, like for example, when it's in bloom, that means that you're going to go do something else. So you're not necessarily using that particular plant for food or medicine, but you're using that plant as something that will make you or indicate you to go do something else. So sometimes something's in bloom and that means you've got to go harvest another plant, or it might be in bloom and that means you need to go hunting. So there are those types of plants that were used just for that purpose. There are a lot of plants that were used for religion and religious practice. I won't be talking about that today. I think I might share a couple of things at the end. There are also plants that were used as part of diplomacy and diplomatic relationships, and there were plants that were used for trade items. I'm going to say a little bit more about this in just a moment. So I want to situate us now in the world of the Blackfeet or the Botany. So oftentimes when we think about the Blackfeet, we think about them living next to the mountains where we are today. And so one of the things that we need to remember and think about is that the Blackfeet historically lived out on the prairies. And this is a photograph on this slide of the area near the Missouri River breaks. So near the Judith River, where the Judith River and the Missouri River, where there's a confluence of those two rivers. That area kind of in central Montana is really sort of the center of historic Blackfeet territory. And if you take a look at the map that's on the slide right now, one of the things you'll see is sort of the darkened area in the middle is sort of historic Blackfoot territory, which is from the Yellowstone River to the south, all the way to the Saskatchewan River to the north. The Rocky Mountains are to the west, and then the confluence of where the Yellowstone and the Missouri meet, which is kind of now where the border is between Montana and North Dakota, is sort of the edge of historic Blackfoot territory. One of the things you'll also see on this particular map is over towards the mountains, towards the west, is where the Blackfoot live today. So we have the Blackfeet Reservation in the state of Montana. And then in Canada, there are 3 reserves, the Kainai Reserve, the Pagan Reserve, and the Siksika Reserve, which are all in Canada. So the Blackfeet continue to live on 4 either reservations or reserves in Montana and Alberta. But because of colonization, because of settlement, the Blackfeet did get pushed over towards the mountains. But one of the things to remember is sort of this historic territory. This is important to remember when we're talking about plants and when we're teaching about plants, because there are multiple ecosystems, which I'll share with you in a minute, of this region, that the Blackfeet have plants that are within those ecosystems that are not necessarily on the reservation today. So there are some plants that the Blackfeet used historically or continue to use today that are not on the reservation. One final thing I want to mention about this map is one of the historic names that the Blackfoot called themselves was the Sokiotapi, which means prairie peoples. And so this gives you an idea of the huge kind of prairie territory that was their land and their landscape. So next I want to mention the 4 major ecosystems in what is the state of Montana. This slide you can actually Google if you want to and use in your classroom. And the 4 major ecosystems that are in the state of Montana are, of course, the Intermountain grasslands, which is often called foothills as well, the forests, the plains grasslands, which is the majority of the state of Montana, and then shrub grasslands. So one of the things you'll notice from these 4 different maps of Montana is that the majority of the ecosystems in the state of Montana are grasslands. And then the other major part is forests. So what I'd like to speak about next is how Indigenous peoples of the past used their land. And remember the map that I had of sort of historic Blackfoot territory, which was this large area of what is now Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And again, there was multiple ecosystems within their historic territory. And so they were using a lot of different plants from those ecosystems. But what I'd like to share now is like, how exactly did they use the land within that area? So there are several different ways that land was used, and I'm just going to sort of map out 4 main ways. What I would like folks to take away from this, and when you're in a teaching opportunity, is to share with your students, is that all of the land that was within historic Indigenous territory was known to them, was used by them, and was managed. So there really was no place within historic Indigenous landscapes that was unused or unknown. So the first type of land or landscape I'd like to discuss is places where people lived. So people did live in villages, and people did have areas that they frequented on a regular basis. So there were places where they were always there. Those places were always managed or tended or cultivated. That's the kind of words that I like to use when we talk about the land and landscape of Indigenous people. One of the words I try to avoid using is the word wild or wilderness, only because that really is a much more, that term and terminology is more contemporary. And it means, and the translation or the meaning of that particular word means, quote unquote, untrammeled by man, which means unused by man. And one of the things I want to point out with indigenous land use, it was used by people, and they really had only one type of land and landscape that was unused by humans, which I'll mention in just a minute. So the next type of land that they had were places that they would go for resources. So not places where they would actually physically live, like not a village area, but sort of outside of the village area. And these places were also managed places, but they were places where they would go and, for example, if they were agricultural people, where they would have their farms. and gardens. If they were not agricultural people, places that they had tended so that they would be abundant with the type of plant life that they were then going to harvest. Another type of area that people had were areas that were between groups. So there was always an area that was between one tribe's territory and another tribe's territory that became what we call in environmental sciences a buffer zone, right? So it was an area between two different groups. Oftentimes people didn't live in these areas and they used them occasionally, but not very often because it was kind of this buffer zone. But those places were usually very rich in biodiversity, and they were places that, again, were managed or cultivated. And so the last type of land that I want to discuss are places that were considered holy or sacred landscapes. Oftentimes, a holy or a sacred landscape had limited or minimal kind of management. So these were places that were left to the supernatural realm. So oftentimes, for example, there may be a supernatural entity or a being who lives in a particular place. And so because there's a supernatural entity living in that particular place, humans don't go there. Humans don't frequent that area. They leave that place to the supernatural realm. If that is the case, oftentimes they are not managing that landscape or cultivating that landscape. They're leaving that landscape to the supernatural. That is really the only type, that's the only time or the only spaces oftentimes that are unmanaged landscapes within traditional Indigenous territories. So again, oftentimes, almost all of the landscape that Indigenous people use was either managed, tended, cultivated in some way. And all of the land within their territories was known to them. It fell into one of these kind of four categories of use. So next I want to talk about trade. So one of the things we don't often think about when we think about Indigenous people, and especially people, Indigenous people before contact, before Europeans arrived and before Americans arrived in this region, is that there was a rich and well-connected trade system across North America. So the map that I'm sharing with you here is just this kind of Rocky Mountain West region of the United States. But these trade networks went, from east to west and north to south, all across North America. But there were two really major trading areas within this kind of Rocky Mountain West area. One was on the Columbia River, and there were a couple on the Missouri River. People often saw them as one instead of two, and that is on our map here, these square red boxes. And so what I would like to say about trading areas is that one of the main things that people traded at these trading areas were plants. And there were different types of plants, again, either as food or as medicine, but also plants that were raw materials, plants that then became manufactured materials. And these became something that as Indigenous people were harvesting plants, they almost always harvested a surplus of certain plants that they used as trade items that they would take to trade and barter. Oftentimes, when we think of these trading areas, we think of them as places where people were trading meat, right? We're thinking of that where they're trading animals. So for example, at the Dells, along the Columbia River, we're thinking about salmon, that people were, harvesting salmon and trading salmon as a resource. when we look at the Mandan Hidatsa area, oftentimes people thought what was happening there where they were hunting bison and trading in bison. But both of these places were actually very rich with trade around plant and plant resources. So what I'd like to share here, and again, this is something that within the classroom that you can share with students, is that how did this trade develop? So even though Montana sort of has 4 main ecosystems, we really only have 2 major ones, right? We have grasslands and we have forest. And one of the things that we should recognize about Indigenous peoples is that there's really not any one ecosystem that provides all of the materials that you need to live your life. And so you often rely on other places to get those materials. And this was something that Indigenous people had done for thousands of years, which is why these really complex trade centers got started and these trading systems got started. So again, kind of the major things that they traded were food that was dried, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute, medicines, raw materials, and then manufactured goods. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes people would bring the raw material to a trading site. So for example, people would collect ash, which is a tree, ash wood, bring it to a trading center. Somebody there would have the skill and they would have the experience to make, for example, bows and arrows. And so they would take that ash wood, they would turn it into arrows, and then they would quote unquote sell it back to other people as a manufactured good. So there was this trade often between raw materials and then manufactured goods back to people. This all happened before contact. So again, there was this sort of complex system of folks who were trading in a lot of different plant materials. Because again, there really is no sort of one place, one ecosystem that has every single plant that you're going to need to survive. And so people relied on other folks to do that. So for example, here in what is now the state of Montana, most people harvested wild plant foods, but those areas were places that they had cultivated, and they would go over to the Mandan Hidatsa villages, which were agricultural, and the Mandan Hidatsa, grew things like corn, and they grew squash, and they grew beans, and they grew sunflower seeds. And so there would be a trade between domesticated and gardened plant materials with the wild. And so folks who harvested from the wild would take it to a trade center, and they'd trade for those domesticated species of plants. And so there was sort of this rich, again, a trade system that went on for thousands of years. So next, I'd like to say something about harvesting and preservation of plants. And again, in this case, I'm going to be focusing primarily on food plants, although there is a similarity between when you harvest medicinal and sometimes plants that are used for material resources, but not necessarily. So the slide I'm going to show you next is about the harvest time for food plants on kind of the northern Great Plains. So historically, the Blackfeet believed that there were 2 seasons of the year, winter and summer. And they didn't divide it up into the 4 seasons, which the 4 seasons is really a Western idea that was introduced to the Blackfeet and other indigenous groups after settlement, after colonization. And so when the Blackfeet thought of the summer, I'm dividing it up into 3 time periods to look so that it looks like the Western system, but they would not have divided it up this way. So in the early springtime, when we're talking about food, this is the time when a lot of roots, certain roots were dug up, when a lot of buds and stems, when they're just first coming out of the ground or when they're first coming on trees, would be collected, certain leaves, and then also the sap of certain plants or the inner bark. And so I'll just give you a non-Blackfeet example, but think about something like maple syrup, which you can find in your local grocery store. You know, maple syrup is a sap that comes out during the springtime that people will harvest and then process and turn it into syrup. In the summer, the middle of the summertime is when the majority of leaves and stems were collected, and different types of flowers, from catkins to flower petals. And then in the late summer or fall is when really the majority of plant foods were gathered, besides roots in the early summer. In the late summer is when berries and different types of fruits, but also nuts and seeds were gathered. So during the year, Indigenous people and the Blackfeet would organize their community life around when they were gathering certain types of food plants. So one of the things we need to remember when we think about the past, and I'll go to my next slide here, is once people harvested plants that they used either, again, for food or for medicine or for material goods, how did they preserve them? So today we have refrigeration, right? We have a giant freezer, right? Usually in our garage or our basement, we've got our giant fridge. In the past, the main way that people preserved foods was through drying them. We still do this today. So again, if you're using this within the classroom, you know, remind your students that we still use drying as one of the main ways to preserve food. So look at pasta, which is dried. Look at rice, which is dried. Look at beans that you get at the grocery store that are dried. So we still use drying as a technique for food preservation. And we use the same techniques with those foods that people did in the past. So on this slide, this is a picture of prairie turnips, which are not a turnip. They just got called that. In Blackfeet, this is called moss. But this particular plant is a root. It was dug up in the early spring. It was usually braided like this. It kind of looks like a garlic braid, right? But this is a prairie turnip braid. And then these were dried and then reconstituted by boiling. So very similar to the way that we take pasta or rice or dried beans from the grocery store, and then to reconstitute them for us to eat them, we boil them in water. That is exactly what the Blackfeet and other Indigenous people did in the past. They dried the majority of the foods that were either roots or were berries or were leaves, and then they would reconstitute those later by boiling them in water. So a lot of the foods that the Blackfeet historically ate and still eat today are things like soups and stews, and a lot of things like tea, and different types of drinks where you're mixing water and plants. The other way that people historically preserved plants is after they were dried, they then would sometimes mix them with oil or fat. And then once they did that, they would allow that fat or or sometimes oil to then solidify, and they would use that later. The other thing I wanted to add here is that they did have different methods, as I mentioned earlier, of pest control, but also preservation. You know, how do you keep foods from going bad? Or how do you keep, when you are storing your food, how do you keep pests away? Whether they're things like mice or whether they are things like, you know, insects. And they did do that with a couple of different methods. One was by using tobacco, one was by using wood ash. They also used wild mint as a preservation technique. So different tribes had different ways of preserving their food and or for pest control. And these are a few that the Blackfeet used. So I'm going to say a little bit now about Blackfeet plant knowledge or Piikani plant knowledge. And again, I'm only focusing on foods, and I'm only going to give a few examples here. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of other things that I think are important to talk about when we talk about teaching students about plants and plant knowledge. So similar to other indigenous peoples, the Blackfeet or the Piikani, of course, knew hundreds of different plants. Depending on where they were, what ecosystem they were in, whether they were up in the mountains or they were down in the prairies, whether they were by, you know, a large river valley or they were in a dry, arid area, they knew all of the plants that were within their environment. So remember what my definition was of ethnobotany, right, versus botany. So although the Blackfeet knew about all of the plants that were within the ecosystems that they live, that doesn't mean they used every single plant. And so oftentimes they had names for all of the plants that they used, that they had a relationship with, and they knew of the plants that they did not use. So what I wanted to focus on in the next few slides is to share that, of course, the Blackfeet used over 200 different plants for food and medicine. And one of the things that we are now learning, and I'll say this in two different ways, one of the things that Western science and the academy is now learning is that the majority of indigenous peoples who lived in this this latitude of what is now the United States probably got the majority of their caloric intake or the food that they ate from plant foods. One of the common stereotypes about indigenous people or about the Blackfeet themselves is that the majority of the food that they ate actually came from animals, right? So for example, on the Northwest, there's a common stereotype that the majority of food they ate was salmon or was bull trout. On the central Montana area, the Northern Great Plains area, the common stereotype is that indigenous people primarily ate bison. And one of the things that we are learning, or I should say Western science is learning, is that is not the case. It is probably true that the majority of food that indigenous people ate was probably plant foods and not as much meat as people thought. But here's what I'd say. If you had talked to grandma would have told you, and you said, hey, what kinds of foods did we eat in the past? She would have listed the 200 types of foods and medicines that indigenous people ate in the past. The list for food plants is much longer than the list for meat. So I want to share with you some research that was done at the University of Washington by an anthropologist there who was interested in this same question of like, what did people eat in the past? What is kind of the percentage of what people ate between plant foods and between wild, meat and protein. And from their research, one of the things that they found was that the majority of foods, more than 50% of the foods that people ate either by weight or by calorie intake was from plants, whether it was from roots or from berries. And then the next major portion of people's diet came primarily from fat. So high fat foods that sometimes were also protein, which means they were an animal, but they would look for high fat content animals to eat. So oftentimes when they were eating bison and hunting bison, they were only interested in bison that had a high fat content. And so that meant, for example, hunting for cows in the fall when they knew that they were going to have a high body weight of fat. Or, for example, on the western side of Montana, fishing for bull trout or fishing for salmon that has a high fat content. And the actual amount of meat or lean protein that people were eating is a very small amount of people's daily diet. So I wanted to share this with you to think about, again, when we are teaching about ethnobotany and we're teaching about native plants and native plant foods, that they actually probably formed the majority of the food that people ate on a daily basis. And this idea that indigenous people ate meat all the time, or that was the majority of the food they ate, is probably not true. And again, we're learning this from our two different knowledge systems, right? We're learning it from Western science, but we're also learning it from grandma, because grandma knew this already. So let me share just a couple of different plant foods that the Blackfeet historically ate, and just give you an idea of what kinds of things would have been a normal part of their diet. And again, thinking back towards the table that I just shared with you. So again, this is a plant that the Blackfeet called moss, which is the prairie turnip. And prairie turnips, again, we are now learning from Western science, were probably very widely harvested across the northern Great Plains. Recent research from the University of Kansas, for example, showed that there were probably millions, and that's the M number, millions of prairie turnips that were harvested across the northern Great Plains every single year. What is interesting about this particular plant, first of all, it is almost pure carbohydrate. So very similar to today, the way we would eat, for example, potatoes or pasta or rice, right? Which are all carbohydrates. This particular plant, what we know about it, again, from our two knowledge systems, what we know now from Western science, but what we know from grandma as well, is that this particular plant takes several years to grow to maturity for it to be harvested. One of the things that we know from talking to grandma is that historically people did not go to the same place each year to harvest. They would go to one patch, they would harvest there. The next year they'd go to another patch, they'd harvest there. The next year they'd go to another patch and they'd harvest there. And they would go to patches on a 3 to 5 year schedule, because once they harvested this particular plant, they would harvest it. And when it gets harvested is as the plant is going to seed, they would take the seeds, they would dig the whole plant up, take the roots, they would take the seeds from the top of the plant, they'd put it back in the hole, they would close the hole up, and then they would go on to the next one. So as they were digging up the root for this particular plant, they're reseeding that hole. So now they have to wait that 3 to 5 years until those particular seeds are fully mature to be able to be harvested. So they would continue this strategy of harvesting this particular plant, but then also burying the seeds. And again, this was done across the Northern Great Plains millions of times each season. And so Indigenous women knew exactly where to go the next year and the next year and the next year. They did not have to, quote unquote, like go searching for this type of plant. They knew exactly where to find it. And that's part of when we talk about sort of Indigenous knowledge and how people know about plants and their uses. And I use the term, for example, managed, tended, cultivated. They were cultivating this land and landscape. This was not, even though it was technically, quote unquote, a wild plant, it was also treated as if it was a domesticated plant species because it was replanted every single year. This is a really common plant across Montana. Probably most of us have harvested it. And this is called a service berry or a Saskatoon berry or a June berry is a common name. But this was also widely harvested by the Blackfeet and other tribes. Similar to the prairie turnip, Blackfeet would cultivate areas and by either transplanting this particular plant to particular areas that they wanted it to be. So again, they wouldn't have to go out and search for berries that they were interested in having. They would actually cultivate areas so that the berries would be there when they wanted to go look for them. And I'll give you an example. There is a place that is in Alberta, just across the border, kind of across the border, I guess, sort of by Havre. And there's a small town there now called Many Berries. But that particular site is kind of, if you see it and you're driving by it, it looks like you're in the middle of the prairies. Everything is yellow. There's nothing there, but there's a small creek kind of going through. That area is incredibly rich with plant life. Many different species of berries there. And it got the name Many Berries from the Blackfeet because over time it was a cultivated area where people would either transplant plants there or they would use different methods of management to make sure that the plant life there was abundant. So every time they went there, they knew they could find all of these different berries that they wanted to use either as food or as medicine, or sometimes berry branches were used for different types of tools. So the other thing to remember when we think about food is that, of course, there was always different methods of seasoning our food, either through plants, but also other methods as well. And there were also sweeteners. Of course, the sweeteners in the past are not like our sweeteners today. And the palate of the past is very different than the palate that we have today. And by that, I mean that what people thought tasted good is very different in the past than it is today. Today, we eat foods that are much more salty and much more sweet than they were in the past. And in the past, a lot of times, one of the major ways that people would season a food, and that just, for example, in this photograph, this is a picture of an onion, a wild onion. But there are multiple species of onions and chives across the state of Montana that were always used for seasoning within foods. Also within this slide is camas. And camas is a plant, it's a bulb that would get harvested and then it would get processed. And in the while it was being processed, it would turn into almost pure fructose. And so as a plant that went through that process, became what then was an additive or a sweetener to other foods. Sometimes camas was eaten all by itself as kind of a super kind of power food because it was a combination of carbohydrate and sugars. But oftentimes, at least for the Blackfeet on the central part of Montana, it was used as an additive, as a sweetener to things. But it's not the only thing that was used as a sweetener. There are a lot of other plants. One of the things I want to mention about just sort of the examples I just gave you, even though I gave you one example for a root and sort of one example for a berry, really there were, again, dozens of roots that the Blackfeet and other indigenous people ate, dozens of berries that people ate. When we look at seasonings, again, we're talking about, you know, a dozen different things that they used for seasonings. And so when we look at the past, we need to think about that there really was this diversity of different types of foods and that people ate, and also these sort of seasonings and sweeteners. And I know that you're going to be learning more about this in the future from other presenters who are going to focus just on different types of foods that their particular tribal group has eaten, and those particular plants that were used for food, that kind of that whole food systems. I also wanted to talk about a couple of other kinds of ways that indigenous people used plants. And I want to talk about smoking and tobacco. And the reason why I want to talk about that is oftentimes in the school system, we rightfully talk about not using tobacco as a public health issue. And when we talk about tobacco in that case, it really is commercial tobacco, which is a particular species of tobacco that has been cultivated over the years and bred over the years to have like a higher and higher nicotine content, which is not healthy. But indigenous people have used different plants, and they've also used tobacco for different purposes. And one of the things I always want to encourage people to think about, especially when they're teaching this as a subject, is to teach that people have used different plants for smoking and for tobacco use that is culturally appropriate, and that it's not something that we should sort of just have a zero tolerance completely for smoking and tobacco, but that it has a particular use and purpose within indigenous society and indigenous culture. And so I just want to briefly mention that here as I'm reaching the end of my as I'm reaching the end of this presentation. So at least for the Blackfeet and for other indigenous people, there were sort of two overarching types of smoking that were done in the past. One was social. So think about sort of just daily, what people would do on a day-to-day basis. For the Blackfeet, historically, social smoking was done with plants that were not tobacco. And I'll explain that in just a minute. There is a difference between tobacco, like the Nicotiana species, versus other plants. Then the other way that the Blackfeet historically and still use tobacco or plants for smoking was for diplomatic purposes and diplomacy. So that meant when they met other tribal groups, or when they met with either the Europeans or the Americans, tobacco was used as part of that diplomatic process between the two groups. Tobacco was also used as part of ceremony and religion. And in this particular case, tobacco is really kind of highly kind of regulated, so to speak, because there is a lot of proper protocol that has to go into when and how you use tobacco that's part of religion or part of ceremony. So I just wanted to share a few plants. I would not teach this in the classroom, so don't teach your students how to go out and gather these plants or to use them for social smoking, but I just wanted to share that these are plants that both historically that the Blackfeet used for social smoking, but also people continue to use these today for social smoking. But these are three different plants that were collected, harvested, processed. There, you do have to process them before you smoke them, which I won't share with you right now. And then they were usually mixed, and then this mixture was then used again, as something that was considered. This is not religious. This is secular, and it's for social purposes. However, when we're talking about diplomatic or religious uses of tobacco, we are really talking about tobacco. So we are talking about that Nicotiana species. There are a couple of different species that were used here in the state of Montana and by the Blackfeet themselves. One of the things that you will notice, if you do know what commercial tobacco looks like, commercial tobacco, which is a different Nicotiana species than this, looks completely different. It grows between 6 and 8 feet tall. The leaves are huge. The leaves are as big as a pillow or a pillowcase. That's how big the leaves are. Whereas this particular tobacco is much smaller. It usually only grows about 2 or 3 feet tall, and the leaves are very small and narrow. The difference as well between this particular type of tobacco and the commercial tobacco is this has a very low nicotine content. And so historically, people did not become addicted to this type of tobacco because of that really low nicotine content, and because they only used it in those very strict situations, whether diplomatic or religious. So I want to end by just mentioning briefly something about medicinal plants that are used for health and healing. And I'm not going to be talking about giving any actual plant examples, but just talking about it in general. When I usually teach about plants in the classroom, if I am teaching younger people, or I am teaching people who are new to the topic, I almost always talk about food and food plants first, partly because it's really interesting. It's something that people can connect to. People always would love to eat stuff in class. So when you can share that kind of stuff in class, it's really important. Medicinal plants is different. I think medicinal plants, you always have to be careful to make sure that people really understand about the plants that you're talking about learning how to harvest them correctly and ethically, and to be able to actually learn from a practitioner. I rarely share about medicinal plants that are not really common because I don't want somebody to accidentally ingest a plant incorrectly, use it incorrectly, and not be able to kind of get the full benefit of a medicinal plant that they actually want to incorporate. So that's why I rarely teach about these in the classroom, because I think you can still teach about ethnobotany and native plants through food, through tools, through games, through a lot of other uses of plants, and not through medicinal plants. But I do want to say sort of one thing about how the Blackfeet and other Indigenous people think about health and healing, but also plants that are used for medicine. So one of the things I would say about the way that the Blackfeet think about medicine is that they do divide it up into sort of 2 different realms. And that is sort of the physical realm and the metaphysical or supernatural realm. So oftentimes, when a person is ill, they would go to a person who is knowledgeable about medicinal plants. When I was growing up, many people went to my grandmother in my grandmother's house to ask about medicinal plant knowledge. And she would ask them about, what their issue was, what the medical issue was, and to try to see how to address it. So oftentimes people would go first to somebody who is knowledgeable in sort of the natural, the physical realm. And those people, if they said, yes, something is, whatever it is, say you have a headache, and you go to that person and they say, okay, well, here are the plants that you can use, something that actually is going to address that particular issue. whether it's an analgesic, an antibiotic, an anti-inflammatory, etc. Those plants actually do those things. And that is within kind of the physical / natural realm. If, though, you went to that same person with that knowledge and they talk to you and you still have the same symptom, so you say, you know what, I have a headache, and they go, I think this is not physical. I think that you have a different issue and you need to go talk to a spiritual leader or a religious leader. And then you are stepping into a different realm, the metaphysical or the supernatural realm. When you go do that and you go talk to a spiritual leader or a religious leader, they are going to prescribe a different kind of plant. And there are dozens of those plants that they then use for that type of healing. That type of healing is going to be different than the physical realm. And I bring this up because oftentimes when you look at some of the field guides or there's information out there about ethnobotany and how Indigenous people use plants, they will oftentimes say, oh, well, this plant was used for this and this plant was used for that. And they don't really share at what point the plant actually has sort of that medical quality in it that will address that versus what you would be using in those other places. And so that's important to recognize as you are thinking about how Indigenous peoples use plants in kind of their daily lives. So I wanted to end with kind of a reminder of what the topic was today, which is sort of ethnobotany and what this terminology is. So as a reminder, sort of ethnobotany is the scientific study of the relationship between people and plants, whereas botany is the study of all plants. Again, I wanted to remind you that these are both Western terms that are used within Western science. Oftentimes, Indigenous people do not use the phrase ethnobotany when they're talking about plants. They sometimes have other words within their own languages that they use that talk about plant knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, or medicinal plants or food plants. Oftentimes the terminology they use is related to how the plants are being used. But ethnobotany is a useful term to use, especially when you're teaching about how Indigenous people related to their natural world, how they related to the environment and the ecosystems that they lived in, because it has been a term that's been used for, again, over 100 years as a scientific term to describe the relationship that humans have with plants. So I would like to end there and thank everybody for their time. Thank you for coming to this particular webinar. Again, I encourage you, I think there's a little bit of time maybe for 1 or 2 questions. And I will let our host decide what those are. But I strongly encourage you to come to the coming workshops. There are some really amazing people that are coming up and some excellent workshops that I know you're really going to enjoy. And so I really encourage you to join in this monthly workshops that will be happening throughout the winter and coming spring. So thank you very much. And thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much. This has just been a professional dream come true, as plant knowledge is such a passion, a personal passion of mine. And you've been, one of my, you didn't even know it, but you've been one of my mentors as I've read through your work and sat in on some of your other webinars. And I so appreciate it. We do have a few questions and we do have a few minutes. One of the questions that I thought was really great was, I am curious, how do tribes manage or cultivate the buffer zones between tribes?
So, yeah, I mean, one of the ways that that was done is through, well, there's multiple ways. So one way was through anthropogenic fire. So fire was often used as a strategy between areas. But it was also places were cultivated to, again, grow certain plants so that as you were going from place to place that you would be able to find the plants that were there. So people oftentimes, again, sort of transplanted plants. They would, if they harvested a plant, they would regrow the plant right in the same place. Oftentimes people culled areas. If they thought there were too much of a particular plant that they didn't want there, they would pull it the same way we pull weeds today, right? Or again, they would use fire. So there were multiple methods that people would use to cultivate areas and especially to increase the biodiversity of those areas.
Ooh, I like this question. Are there books that you recommend? Well, that's a good question too. Are there books that you recommend as a good resource at an introductory level? But there's also another question. What is your favorite book on Blackfeet plant use?
So let me pull from my my bookshelf here two books that I always suggest. Oops, excuse me. So usually you should try and find a good field guide that you can use for helping with identification. Not all field guides are going to include ethnobotanical plants that are useful or used by Indigenous people. And I have definitely found this true with a lot of the plants that the Blackfeet use for medicine. They're not included in field guides. So you have to find their photograph somewhere. One excellent field guide in Montana is online, which is called fieldguide.mt.gov. Maybe somebody can type that in the chat. So fieldguide.mt.gov, it's online, and you can pull up any native plant, also invasive species, any native plant in the state of Montana. There's going to be a photograph of it. It's going to say, it's going to tell you what ecosystem it's from, and it's going to like provide information like how tall it should be or how short it should be, etc. Okay, but two of the books that I really like, but do not have any like color photos, don't expect that, but have information about plants, are out of the University of Kansas. University of Kansas has done some really great work on native plants of the Northern Great Plains. And one of the things in these particular two books that I'm going to show you, let me see if I can do this without, can you kind of see? There we go.
And I will also add these titles to the resources.
Okay. So these are both by Kelly Kincher, who is a professor at the University of Kansas. So this one is the edible plants of the prairies. And then there's also another one called medicinal plants of the prairies. And what's excellent about these particular books, and I'm just going to randomly select something in here. So this is a wild plant or a plant called alum root. And so they have there's just kind of a drawing, again, it's not in color. There's drawing in there. One of the things that they do in this, or he does in this these two books, is he includes the ethnobotanical information from multiple tribes, and he includes their name in their tribe. So he will include the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Lakota, and he has a little bit of information from each one of the tribes. So no matter where you are in the state of Montana, if you are teaching students about plants and you're teaching about ethnobotanical uses by all of the different tribes of Montana, those are excellent resources to start with to be able to share about plant knowledge on the Northern Great Plains.
Excellent. And I've actually consulted with Dr. Kincher before, and he's a
Okay.
lovely human being and was so helpful. I like this. What policy initiatives should we be aware of in terms of utilizing Native knowledge for environmentalism and land use?
Oh, that's a good question. So here's what I'd say. Usually tribes, and I'll just give the Salish Kootenai tribe. So I'm in Salish territory. I live in Salish territory here. The Salish Kootenai, the Salish Culture Committee, which is out of St. Ignatius, they work really hard with a lot of different groups who write about them to vet what they are writing, so that whatever they create and make public, that the Culture Committee has read through it and approves that work. They also publish their own materials, and they have an amazing website, really amazing website. They have vetted all of that information. There is nothing on their website, there is nothing that they've published that is going to be considered like quote unquote like sacred knowledge or knowledge that has been misappropriated or anything like that, because they have gone through the process of vetting it. So for example, I believe next week you will have Rose Bear Don't Walk as a presenter.
Next month.
Yes. Oh, next month. Sorry, next month. If you have not downloaded her master's thesis, you should definitely do that. So all you have to do is like go to the University of Montana's library, look up Scholar Works, and then look up Rose Bear Don't Walk. And her master's thesis is publicly available to download. Her master's thesis is excellent, and it's about Salish ethnobotany. She went through all of the steps, the proper steps to get permission. She went to the Elders Committee first and talked to them about her project. She got permission to do it. She went to the Culture Committee and got permission to interview people. She shared everything that she learned with the Culture Committee. She wrote her master's thesis. She gave it back to the Culture Committee and she had them read it before it became public. Now that it's public, it has been vetted, so to speak, by the Culture Committee and by the Elders Committee there to be shared with the public. So that means that anything in there is publicly available to learn from. So both of those examples are good examples to show how Indigenous people do carefully work with researchers and work with, especially like in the Western Academy, Western scientists, to make information available that they think is of interest to the public. I will also add, though, they also have a lot of information that is not public. And that stays within their own Culture Committee. And all of those files are there. We will never see them. And so you as an educator, you do not have to worry about, this thing that I'm using in my classroom, is it okay if I use it? Usually the answer is yes, especially if it has gone through that process. And so that is a great question to ask. But oftentimes most tribes and tribal communities have gone through those processes now in the 21st century with Western scholars and researchers and students, so that what you see out there is usually already been vetted through some sort of process.
Excellent. And I will also include that link under Rose's resources for her presentation next month. And she is here with us. So hi, Rose.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Wondering if you could speak to the educational potential in ethnobotanical gardens. Are there any tips? Are there any lessons learned, particularly with cultural responsiveness?
So yeah, so that's also an excellent question. You know, both kind of ethnobotanical gardens where you're looking at wild food plants and medicines, but also ethnobotanical gardens that are agricultural, right? That are actually, think about things like the three sisters, right? The corn, bean, and squash. Those are excellent opportunities for students to learn about plants. Whether you can create a small garden at your school or program, or even a larger garden, I think those are excellent ways to teach students about both the native plants that are in the state of Montana, but also the culturally cultivated plants. Again, kind of I'm thinking corn, beans, and squashes, the agricultural plants that have been here for a very long time. Though there's some really good examples across the state of Montana of school gardens, community gardens, or even gardens. For example, here at the University of Montana, we have several excellent gardens on campus. We do have an ethnobotanical garden here on campus that is managed by Marilyn Marler. We also have a really excellent native plant garden here on campus. And then inside the University Center, we have an excellent tropical garden of plants. There are some really excellent gardens across the state of Montana, but if your school can start something small or large, you can even do gardens inside the classroom. So there are particular plants that you can grow inside the classroom that don't have to be outside, where you can do both sort of those food plants, or even plants that were used again as tools, etc., or for material objects. Those are excellent learning opportunities, and I always encourage teachers or professors, when they get the chance, to let students be able to the ones who cultivate this plant knowledge. That is a great opportunity.
I'm sure you mentioned this in your presentation, but do you really feel that plants are teachers? I feel like I had my first garden this year, and I just felt if I really listened, the plants would actually tell me what they needed, and it was really remarkable. Can you talk at all about, and this will be the last question, I promise, about plants as teachers?
Well, I'll just say this. I think that it depends on the kind of community and culture that you come from. And so different tribes across the state of Montana have different ideas about the plant world and kind of who they are and what they bring to humans. And I think it's also different between what Americans also think about plants and the relationship between humans and plants. I think what's important to share, though, is there has been for thousands of years here in what is now the state of Montana, human societies, indigenous peoples who have been interacting with the plant worlds here for a long, long time. And there really is a lot of knowledge, again, that you will learn about through this series of workshops. There's a lot of knowledge that's out there. There's a lot of knowledge that continues to be passed down generation to generation, and a lot of knowledge that can be used within the classroom setting and with students for them to really increase their knowledge as a Montana citizen.
Well, I'm seeing some of the comments here about singing to plants and connecting to plants. And I think that's, we certainly have an audience here who is so receptive to all of your knowledge. And I just can't tell you how much respect, regard, and gratitude that I have for everything that you shared this evening. And I really appreciated that you put it into such a tangible context for teachers. And I did see that in some of the comments about, how usable this knowledge could be and how clear what can be shared and what can't be shared. So I just think this was an incredible first start out of the gate, and so exciting that we have some of your friends and former students as some of our future presenters. And it is just such an exciting topic. And I think it's something that, somebody asked me, why ethnobotany? Why is this so important? And I think that, plants are outside of us, and yet they're a part of us because we eat them all the time. And you know, it's a way that we can develop conversations without all of the other things that we might be experiencing in society right now. So I think it's a wonderful vehicle to talk about culture, different cultures, etc. So I just thank you so much. I do want to let everyone know that the feedback survey is open. It is only open for 24 hours. You will get a reminder letter with all of the correct links on it next time, and because I'll be back in Montana. So I think that was part of the issue of Zoom not recognizing who I actually was in Washington. So anyhow, I wish you all a wonderful evening. And again, Dr. LaPier, thank you so much. This was just absolutely wonderful. And we'll be in touch about some of the details a little later. So thank you all. And I hope you all have such a wonderful rest of your school year and a safe rest of your school year. Thank you so much for joining us.